9-year-old calls 911 for help after father locks her in the bathroom to do things with her. 9-year-old Ella Thompson lived a life shrouded in fear and uncertainty. Her small world, a cramped, two-bedroom apartment in a rundown complex on the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia, was dominated by the unpredictable moods and volatile temper of her father, Mark. Ella was a wisp of a girl, with large, brown eyes that held a depth of sadness far beyond her years. She was naturally quiet and introspective, finding solace in drawing and reading, escaping into worlds far removed from the harsh reality of her home life. She loved fairy tales, stories of brave princesses and magical creatures, stories where good always triumphed over evil. Mark Thompson was a man consumed by his demons. He was an alcoholic, his days marked by a relentless cycle of sobriety, relapse, and violent outbursts. When sober, he could be charming, even affectionate, showering Ella with fleeting moments of tenderness that left her yearning for more. But those moments were rare, like brief glimmers of sunlight in a perpetually stormy sky. More often, Mark was a raging storm, his face contorted with anger, his voice a thunderous roar that echoed through the thin walls of their apartment. He was quick to anger, easily provoked by the smallest of infractions: a spilled glass of milk, a misplaced toy, a question asked at the wrong time. Ella had learned to navigate her father's moods with a precocious caution, treading lightly, speaking softly, trying to make herself invisible. She had become adept at reading his subtle cues: the tightening of his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes, the slurring of his speech, warning signs that a storm was brewing. She lived in a constant state of anxiety, her body tense, her senses heightened, always on guard, always waiting for the next outburst. She had learned to anticipate his anger, to brace herself for the inevitable verbal abuse, and, increasingly, the physical violence. It had started with yelling, with harsh words that cut deeper than any knife. Then came the shoving, the pushing, the occasional slap across the face. Lately, the violence had escalated, becoming more frequent, more brutal, more terrifying. Ella had learned to hide her bruises, to make excuses for her injuries, to protect her father from the consequences of his actions. She did this out of fear, but also out of a misplaced sense of loyalty, a desperate hope that the man she once knew, the loving father who occasionally surfaced through the haze of alcohol, would somehow return. She lived in a world of secrets, a world of fear, a world where she had learned to silence her own cries, to swallow her own pain, to survive. She was a child trapped in an adult's nightmare, and she had no one to turn to, no one to trust. Or so she thought. Mark's alcoholism was the dark cloud that hung over Ella's life, poisoning every aspect of their existence. It was a disease that had consumed him, transforming him from a flawed but capable man into a volatile, unpredictable, and dangerous presence. The apartment, once a semblance of a home, had become a reflection of Mark's inner turmoil. Empty beer cans and liquor bottles littered the counters and floors, overflowing the trash cans, emitting a stale, sour odor that permeated everything. Dirty dishes piled up in the sink, attracting flies and cockroaches. Laundry went unwashed, bills went unpaid, and the refrigerator was often bare, except for a few condiments and Mark's ever-present supply of alcohol. Mark had lost his job as a construction worker months ago, due to his frequent absences and his increasingly erratic behavior. He now spent his days drinking, watching television, and sleeping, his life spiraling further and further out of control. He blamed everyone but himself for his problems. He blamed his boss for firing him. He blamed the government for his lack of opportunities. He blamed Ella's mother for leaving him. And he blamed Ella for being a burden, a troublemaker, a constant source of irritation. His anger was often fueled by his drinking, but it was also rooted in a deeper well of resentment, self-loathing, and a profound sense of inadequacy. He felt like a failure, a man who had lost everything, a man who had nothing left to lose. And Ella, his small, vulnerable daughter, became the target of his rage, the scapegoat for his frustrations, the punching bag for his pent-up anger. When he drank, his eyes would glaze over, his speech would become slurred, and his movements would become unsteady. He would stumble through the apartment, shouting obscenities, throwing things, and lashing out at Ella, both verbally and physically. He would call her names, belittle her, and threaten her. He would accuse her of being disobedient, disrespectful, and ungrateful. He would make her feel small, worthless, and utterly alone. Ella had learned to cower, to make herself as small as possible, to try to disappear. She had learned to avoid eye contact, to speak only when spoken to, and to never, ever argue back. She had learned to endure the pain, to suppress her cries, and to hide her injuries. She had learned to survive, to adapt, to become a master of camouflage in her own home. But the toll on her young body and spirit was immense. She was constantly exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She had trouble concentrating in school, her grades were slipping, and she had withdrawn from her friends. She lived in a state of perpetual fear, her body tense, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She was a prisoner in her own home, trapped in a cycle of abuse that seemed endless, inescapable. The alcohol was destroying them both. Ella's mother, Susan, was a ghost in her life, a figure of both longing and resentment. Susan had left when Ella was just 5 years old, unable to cope with Mark's alcoholism and his increasingly abusive behavior. She had promised Ella that she would come back for her, that she would rescue her from the nightmare of their home life. But the years had passed, and the promise had remained unfulfilled. Susan lived in another state, California, having remarried and started a new family. She called Ella occasionally, sent her birthday cards and Christmas presents, but the contact was sporadic, superficial, and ultimately unsatisfying. Ella harbored a complex mix of emotions towards her mother. She loved her, missed her desperately, and yearned for her presence in her life. But she also resented her for leaving, for abandoning her to Mark's care, for failing to protect her. She had built up a fantasy of her mother, a vision of a loving, nurturing woman who would swoop in and save her from her miserable existence. But the reality was far more complicated. Susan had her own struggles, her own demons to contend with. She felt guilty about leaving Ella, but she also felt powerless to change the situation. She had tried, unsuccessfully, to gain custody of Ella, but Mark had fought her every step of the way, and the courts had sided with him. She had sent money when she could, but it was never enough. She had called the police a few times, reporting her concerns about Mark's drinking and his treatment of Ella, but nothing had ever come of it. She felt trapped, caught between her desire to protect her daughter and her inability to do so. She had made a choice, a difficult and painful choice, to prioritize her own survival and the well-being of her new family. But she had left Ella a lifeline, a secret weapon, a symbol of hope in the darkness, an old, deactivated cell phone. This phone can still call 911, even without a service plan, Susan had told Ella, during one of their rare phone calls. If you ever need help, if you're ever in danger, you dial those 3 numbers. They will come and help you. Ella had kept the phone hidden, tucked away in a secret compartment in her backpack, a talisman of hope, a reminder that she was not completely alone. She had never used it, fearing the consequences, fearing Mark's wrath. But she knew that it was there, a lifeline, a last resort, a symbol of her mother's love and a promise of eventual rescue. It was a secret that she guarded fiercely, a secret that gave her a small measure of control in a world where she felt utterly powerless. She knew one day she would have to use it. The day that changed everything began like any other day in Ella's life, filled with a low-level hum of anxiety and the ever-present threat of Mark's anger. Ella had been extra careful that morning, tiptoeing around the apartment, trying to avoid waking her father, who had been drinking heavily the night before. She had made herself a small bowl of cereal, eating it quickly and quietly, her eyes darting towards the closed bedroom door, listening for any signs of movement. She had packed her backpack, carefully placing the secret phone in its hidden compartment, a ritual she performed every morning, a small act of defiance and hope. She had left for school, walking quickly, her head down, trying to blend into the background, trying to avoid attracting any unwanted attention. But her efforts were in vain. When she returned home that afternoon, she found Mark awake, sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him. His eyes were bloodshot, his face flushed, and his expression was ominous. "Where have you been?" he growled, his voice slurred. "School," Ella replied softly, her voice trembling. "Don't lie to me," Mark shouted, slamming his fist on the table, making Ella jump. "I called the school. They said you skipped your last 2 classes." Ella's heart sank. She had skipped her afternoon classes, unable to concentrate, overwhelmed by anxiety and a growing sense of dread. She had spent the time hiding in the library, reading, trying to escape the reality of her life. "I wasn't feeling well," she stammered. "You weren't feeling well," Mark mocked. "You're always not feeling well. You're lazy, you're disobedient, and you're a liar." He stood up, his movements unsteady, his eyes blazing with anger. He grabbed a glass from the counter and smashed it on the floor, the sound echoing through the apartment. "Look what you made me do," he shouted. "You're going to clean that up." Ella, terrified, nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. She knelt down and began to pick up the broken pieces of glass, her hands shaking. She accidentally cut her finger, a small, thin line of blood welling up from the wound. "Now look what you've done," Mark roared. "You're clumsy. You're useless. You're just like your mother." He grabbed Ella by the hair, yanking her to her feet, his grip tight and painful. He dragged her towards the bathroom, his rage escalating with each step. "I'm going to teach you a lesson," he growled. "I'm going to teach you to obey me." He threw her into the bathroom, slamming the door shut and locking it from the outside. Ella was trapped, alone, and terrified. The bathroom was small, cramped, and windowless, the air thick with the smell of mildew and stale cigarette smoke. Mark pounded on the door, shouting obscenities, his voice a terrifying roar that reverberated through the small space. "You're going to stay in there until you learn to behave," he yelled. "You're going to be punished." Ella huddled in the corner, her body trembling, her tears flowing freely. She felt a surge of panic, a desperate need to escape, to get away from her father's rage. This felt different. This felt worse. She had to do something. Inside the cramped bathroom, Ella's fear gave way to a desperate, primal instinct for survival. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that this time was different, that her father's rage had reached a new and dangerous level. She remembered the phone, the secret phone her mother had given her, the lifeline that she had kept hidden for so long. She fumbled in her backpack, her hands shaking, her heart pounding. She pulled out the old, battered flip phone, its screen cracked, its buttons worn. She flipped it open, her fingers trembling as she dialed the 3 numbers, 911. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring felt like an eternity, a desperate plea echoing in the silence of the bathroom. Finally, a voice answered, calm and professional. 911, what's your emergency? Ella, her voice choked with sobs, could barely speak. Help me, she whispered. My dad, he's hurting me. The dispatcher, a woman named Sarah Miller, no relation to previous stories, immediately recognized the urgency in Ella's voice. She had been trained to handle calls from children, to extract information quickly and efficiently, to assess the level of danger, and to dispatch help. Okay, honey, Sarah said, her voice soothing and reassuring. I'm here to help you. Can you tell me your name? Ella, she whispered, her voice trembling. Ella, where are you? I'm in the bathroom, Ella sobbed. My dad, he locked me in here. He's going to hurt me. Is your dad still there, Ella? Sarah asked, her voice calm but firm. Yes, Ella whispered. He's outside the door. He's yelling. Sarah could hear the muffled sounds of Mark's rage in the background, the pounding on the door, the shouting. She knew that time was of the essence. Okay, Ella, she said. I'm sending the police to help you. Stay on the line with me, okay? Don't hang up. She quickly typed the information into her computer, dispatching the nearest patrol cars to Ella's address. She also alerted the paramedics, knowing that Ella might be injured. She continued to talk to Ella, trying to keep her calm, trying to gather more information, trying to keep her safe. Ella, can you tell me your address? Ella, struggling to remember, recited her address, her voice barely audible above the sounds of her father's rage. Okay, honey, Sarah said. The police are on their way. They'll be there soon. Just stay on the line with me. She listened to Ella's sobs, her whispered pleas for help, her fear palpable even through the phone line. She felt a surge of empathy for the little girl, trapped in a terrifying situation, her life hanging in the balance. She stayed on the line with Ella, offering words of comfort and reassurance, counting down the seconds until the police arrived, praying that they would get there in time. The longest minutes of her life. The sound of sirens, growing louder with each passing second, pierced the air, a beacon of hope in the midst of Ella's terror. She could hear the screech of tires, the slamming of car doors, and the shouts of police officers. "Police! Open up!" a voice boomed through the apartment. Mark, startled by the sudden arrival of the police, stopped pounding on the bathroom door. He stood frozen, his eyes wide with a mixture of anger and fear. The police officers, having received the 911 call and information about a child in danger, broke down the front door of the apartment, their weapons drawn. "Where is she?" one of the officers demanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. Mark, still in a drunken rage, gestured towards the bathroom. "She's in there," he growled. "She's a liar. She's making it all up." The officers, ignoring Mark's protests, rushed to the bathroom door. They could hear Ella's sobs from inside, her muffled cries for help. "Ella, it's the police," one of the officers shouted. "We're here to help you. Are you okay?" "Help me," Ella cried, her voice weak but filled with relief. "He's going to hurt me." The officers, unable to open the locked door, kicked it down, the wood splintering and cracking under the force of their blows. They burst into the small bathroom, their weapons trained on Mark, who was standing near the sink, the coiled electric cord still clutched in his hand. Ella was huddled in the corner, her body trembling, her face streaked with tears and blood. She was clutching her stomach, moaning in pain. "Drop the cord," one of the officers shouted at Mark, his voice commanding. "Drop it now." Mark, momentarily stunned by the swift and decisive action of the police, hesitated for a moment. He looked from the officers to Ella, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and defeat. He dropped the cord, his hands shaking. The officers immediately moved in, subduing him, forcing him to the ground, and handcuffing him. He struggled briefly, cursing and shouting, but the officers quickly overpowered him. One of the officers, a young woman named Officer Ramirez, no relation to previous stories, rushed to Ella's side, kneeling down beside her, her expression filled with concern. "Ella, honey, it's okay," she said, her voice soft and soothing. "You're safe now. We're here to help you." Ella looked up at the officer, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. She reached out her hand, and Officer Ramirez took it, holding it gently. He hurt me," Ella whispered, her voice trembling. Officer Ramirez examined Ella, noting the bruises on her arms, the swelling on her face, and the blood on her finger. She saw the fear in her eyes, the trauma etched on her young face. "We're going to get you to a hospital, honey," she said. "We're going to take care of you." The paramedics, who had arrived with the police, entered the bathroom, their movements swift and efficient. They assessed Ella's injuries, placed her on a stretcher, and carried her out of the apartment, away from the scene of violence, away from her abusive father. Mark was led out in handcuffs, his head hung low, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and defiance. He was taken into custody, charged with child abuse, assault, and resisting arrest. As Ella was being carried out, she saw her father being led away. She felt a flicker of sadness, a lingering attachment to the man who had once been her protector, but it was quickly overshadowed by a profound sense of relief. She was safe. He couldn't hurt her anymore. The nightmare was over, at least for now. But the healing had just begun. She knew she had a long way to go. The emergency room at Richmond General Hospital was a whirlwind of activity, a chaotic scene of flashing lights, beeping monitors, and hurried footsteps. Ella, lying on a stretcher, felt overwhelmed by the noise, the smells, and the unfamiliar faces surrounding her. She was examined by a team of doctors and nurses, their touch gentle but firm, their voices calm and reassuring. They asked her questions, took her vital signs, and assessed the extent of her injuries. She had bruises on her arms, her legs, her face, and her back. She had a cut on her finger, where she had cut herself on the broken glass. She had a large, painful bruise on her abdomen, where her father had kicked her. The doctors ordered x-rays, blood tests, and a CT scan to rule out any internal injuries. They were particularly concerned about the kick to her stomach, fearing potential damage to her organs. Ella, though terrified, cooperated with the medical staff, answering their questions as best she could, enduring the painful procedures with a quiet stoicism that belied her young age. She had learned, through years of abuse, to suppress her emotions, to hide her pain, to make herself small and invisible. But the trauma was evident in her eyes, in the trembling of her body, and the way she flinched at sudden movements or loud noises. She was a child caught in the crosshairs of adult violence, a victim of a crime that had shattered her innocence and left her deeply scarred. A social worker, Ms. Johnson, no relation to previous stories, was assigned to Ella's case. She sat beside Ella's bed, offering comfort, support, and a listening ear. She explained the process, assured Ella that she was safe, and promised that she would do everything in her power to protect her. "Ella, you're very brave," Ms. Johnson said, her voice gentle and compassionate. "You did the right thing by calling 911. You saved your own life." Ella, her eyes filled with tears, nodded. She knew that she had done the right thing, but she also felt a profound sense of sadness, a sense of loss. She had lost her father, the man who was supposed to love her and protect her, to the darkness of his own demons. The medical examination revealed that, thankfully, Ella had no internal injuries. The kick to her stomach had caused bruising and pain, but no lasting damage. The other bruises and cuts were superficial, requiring only basic first aid. But the emotional wounds were far deeper, far more serious, and would require a much longer and more complex healing process. The physical wounds would heal, but the scars on her soul would remain. The doctors and nurses tended to Ella's physical injuries, cleaning and bandaging her wounds, providing her with pain medication, and ensuring that she was comfortable. But they also recognized the need for psychological support, for a safe and nurturing environment where Ella could begin to process the trauma she had endured. They knew that the road ahead would be long and challenging, but they were committed to providing Ella with the care, the support, and the resources she needed to heal and to rebuild her life. They would do everything in their power to help. The news of Ella's abuse and Mark's arrest reached Susan, Ella's mother, in California, like a punch to the gut. She had been at work, teaching a yoga class, when she received the call from Ms. Johnson, the social worker. The words child abuse, hospital, arrest echoed in her mind, a horrifying litany of terms that shattered her world. She felt a wave of nausea, a surge of guilt, a profound sense of failure. She had left Ella, she had abandoned her to a dangerous situation, and now her daughter was paying the price. She had made a choice, a difficult and painful choice, to prioritize her own well-being, and that choice had had devastating consequences. She dropped everything, canceled her classes, and booked the first available flight to Richmond. She spent the agonizing hours on the plane replaying the events of the past few years in her mind, questioning her decisions, blaming herself, and praying that Ella would be okay. When she arrived at the hospital, she was met by Ms. Johnson, who briefed her on Ella's condition, the extent of her injuries, and the legal proceedings that were underway. She explained that Ella was safe, that she was receiving excellent medical care, and that a team of professionals was working to support her. Susan, her emotions raw, demanded to see Ella immediately. Ms. Johnson led her to the pediatric ward, where Ella was lying in a bed, her face pale and bruised, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. The sight of her daughter, so vulnerable and so injured, brought tears to Susan's eyes. She rushed to Ella's bedside, embracing her gently, her heart aching with a mixture of love, guilt, and remorse. "Oh, Ella," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you. I'm so sorry I left you." Ella, her voice weak, whispered, "It's okay, Mommy. It's okay." Susan, clinging to her daughter, vowed to never leave her again. She would fight for custody, she would protect Ella, she would do whatever it took to make up for the years of absence, the years of neglect. She knew that it wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges, obstacles, and setbacks. But she was determined to be the mother Ella needed, a mother she deserved. She would be there for her, every step of the way, offering her unwavering love, support, and protection. She would rebuild their relationship, brick by brick, conversation by conversation, hug by hug. She would earn back Ella's trust, she would heal her wounds, and she would help her to build a future free from fear and abuse. She had made a terrible mistake, but she was determined to make amends, to do everything in her power to create a better life for her daughter. She would not fail her again. She knew what was at stake. The involvement of Child Protective Services (CPS) was a crucial step in ensuring Ella's safety and well-being. Ms. Johnson, the social worker assigned to Ella's case, played a pivotal role in navigating the complex legal and social landscape of child abuse. She conducted a thorough investigation, interviewing Ella, Susan, Mark, who was still in jail, and other individuals who had had contact with the family. She gathered evidence, reviewed medical records, and assessed the home environment. Her findings were clear and unequivocal. Ella had been subjected to severe and prolonged abuse by her father, and she was not safe in his care. Ms. Johnson filed a petition with the juvenile court, requesting that Ella be placed in the temporary custody of CPS. She also requested a restraining order against Mark, prohibiting him from having any contact with Ella. The court, after reviewing the evidence and hearing testimony from Ms. Johnson and other witnesses, granted the petition. Ella was officially removed from her father's custody and placed in the temporary care of CPS. A safety plan was developed, outlining the steps that would be taken to protect Ella and to provide her with the support and services she needed. The plan included placement in a safe and nurturing foster home. Ella would be placed with a licensed foster family, carefully screened and trained to care for children who had experienced trauma. Medical and psychological care. Ella would continue to receive medical treatment for her injuries, and she would begin therapy with a child psychologist specializing in trauma and abuse. Educational support. Ella would be enrolled in a new school, where she would receive individualized attention and support to help her catch up on her missed schooling. Supervised visitation with her mother, Susan, would be allowed to visit Ella, under the supervision of CPS, to begin the process of rebuilding their relationship. Legal representation. Ella would be appointed a guardian ad litem, an attorney who would represent her best interests in the legal proceedings. The legal proceedings against Mark were initiated. He was formally charged with multiple counts of child abuse, assault, and battery. He pleaded not guilty, claiming that Ella was lying, that she had injured herself, and that he was the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by Susan. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. The medical records, the police reports, Ella's testimony, and the testimony of other witnesses painted a clear and consistent picture of abuse. The legal process was long and arduous, but Ms. Johnson and the other professionals involved in Ella's case were determined to see justice served. They were committed to protecting Ella, to holding Mark accountable for his actions, and to ensuring that he would never be able to harm another child. Ella, though initially fearful and hesitant, gradually began to trust Ms. Johnson and the other adults who were working to help her. She realized that they were on her side, that they believed her, and that they were committed to her safety and well-being. She started to open up. Ella's initial recovery was a slow and painful process, marked by both physical and emotional challenges. She was placed in a loving and supportive foster home, with a kind and experienced foster mother, Mrs. Davis, no relation, who had a deep understanding of the needs of traumatized children. Mrs. Davis created a safe and nurturing environment for Ella, a space where she could begin to heal, to feel secure, and to rebuild her sense of trust. She provided Ella with healthy meals, comfortable clothing, and a warm, inviting bedroom. She listened patiently to Ella's fears, her anxieties, and her nightmares. She encouraged her to express her emotions, to draw, to write, to find healthy outlets for her pain. Ella began therapy with Dr. Lee, a child psychologist specializing in trauma and abuse. Dr. Lee used a variety of techniques, including play therapy, art therapy, and cognitive behavioral therapy, to help Ella process the trauma she had endured. She helped Ella to understand that the abuse was not her fault, that she was not to blame, and that she deserved to be safe and loved. She helped her to develop coping mechanisms for managing her anxiety, her flashbacks, and her nightmares. She helped her to rebuild her self-esteem, her sense of self-worth, and her trust in others. The therapy sessions were often difficult and painful, forcing Ella to confront the horrors she had experienced. But they were also essential to her healing, providing her with a safe space to express her emotions, to process her trauma, and to begin to rebuild her life. Susan, Ella's mother, was a constant presence in her daughter's life, visiting her regularly, attending therapy sessions with her, and working to rebuild their relationship. She was filled with remorse for her past mistakes, and she was determined to make amends, to be the mother Ella needed and deserved. She listened patiently to Ella's stories, her fears, and her anxieties. She validated her feelings, apologized for her absence, and promised to never leave her again. She also worked on her own issues, attending therapy to address her own trauma and to learn how to be a more effective and supportive parent. The relationship between Ella and Susan was initially strained, marked by a mixture of love, resentment, and mistrust. But slowly, gradually, they began to reconnect, to rebuild their bond, to forge a new relationship based on honesty, empathy, and mutual respect. Ella's recovery was not linear. There were good days and bad days, moments of progress and moments of setback. But she persevered, drawing strength from her support network, from her own inner resilience, and from her growing hope for the future. She was a survivor, a fighter, and a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome even the most horrific of circumstances. She was beginning to believe in herself again. The trial of Mark Thompson was a highly publicized event, attracting media attention from across the state. The courtroom was packed each day with reporters, community members, and advocates for child abuse prevention. Mark, represented by a court-appointed attorney, continued to maintain his innocence, claiming that Ella was lying, that she had been manipulated by her mother, and that he was the victim of a false accusation. But the prosecution, led by a determined and experienced district attorney, presented a compelling case, building a mountain of evidence that left no doubt about Mark's guilt. They called numerous witnesses to the stand, including Ella, who testified, bravely and eloquently, about the abuse she had endured, her voice trembling but her resolve unwavering. Susan, who testified about her past relationship with Mark, his alcoholism, his violent behavior, and her attempts to protect Ella. Ms. Johnson, the social worker, who testified about her investigation, her findings, and her assessment of Ella's safety and well-being. Dr. Lee, the child psychologist, who testified about Ella's trauma, her symptoms, and her progress in therapy. Officer Ramirez, the police officer who had responded to the 911 call, who testified about the scene at the apartment, Mark's behavior, and Ella's injuries. The emergency room doctors and nurses, who testified about Ella's medical condition, her injuries, and the treatment she had received. Neighbors, who testified about the abuse. The defense attorney attempted to discredit the witnesses, to cast doubt on their testimony, and to portray Mark as a loving father who had been wrongly accused. But the prosecution effectively countered these arguments, presenting overwhelming evidence of Mark's guilt and highlighting the devastating impact of his crimes on Ella. The jury, after deliberating for several hours, returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Mark was convicted of aggravated child abuse, assault and battery, and false imprisonment. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, effectively ensuring that he would never be able to harm Ella or any other child again. A restraining order was also issued, permanently prohibiting him from having any contact with Ella or Susan. The verdict was a victory for Ella, for Susan, and for all victims of child abuse. It sent a clear message that such crimes would not be tolerated, that perpetrators would be held accountable, and that justice would be served. For Ella, the verdict brought a sense of closure, a sense of justice, and a sense of relief. She had faced her abuser, she had told her story, and she had been believed. She had survived, and she had prevailed. But the scars of the abuse, both physical and emotional, would remain with her for the rest of her life. The trial had been a necessary step in the legal process, but it was also a re-traumatizing experience, forcing her to relive the horrors she had endured. She knew that the healing process would be long and ongoing, but she was determined to move forward, to build a better future for herself, and to use her experience to help others. She had found her voice. Ella's neighbors, who had witnessed some of Mark's behavior, felt a deep sense of guilt and regret. They had seen the signs, the occasional bruises on Ella's arms, the way she flinched at loud noises, the way she always seemed to be alone. They had heard the shouting coming from the apartment, the muffled cries, the sounds of things breaking. But they had done nothing. They had told themselves it was none of their business, that it was a family matter, that they didn't want to get involved. They had chosen to remain silent, to turn a blind eye, to ignore the suffering of a child living right next door. After Mark's arrest and the subsequent media coverage, the neighbors were forced to confront their own complicity, their own failure to act. They were ashamed, embarrassed, and deeply sorry. One neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, no relation to the teacher, an elderly woman who lived in the apartment directly below Ella's, finally confessed to Susan that she had often heard Mark yelling and screaming at Ella. She had even heard Ella crying on several occasions, but she had been too afraid to intervene, too afraid of Mark's temper. "I should have done something," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice trembling with remorse. "I should have called the police. I should have knocked on the door. I should have helped that poor little girl." Susan, while initially angry and resentful towards the neighbors for their inaction, eventually came to understand their fear and their hesitation. She realized that many people are afraid to get involved in domestic disputes, fearing retaliation or believing that it's not their place to interfere. But she also emphasized the importance of speaking up, of reporting suspected child abuse, of being a voice for the voiceless. "If you see something, say something," she told them. "Don't be afraid to get involved. You could save a child's life." The neighbors, spurred by guilt and a newfound sense of responsibility, organized a community meeting to discuss the issue of child abuse and domestic violence. They invited speakers from local organizations, including Child Protective Services, domestic violence shelters, and law enforcement agencies. They learned about the signs of abuse, the resources available to victims, and the steps they could take to report suspected cases of abuse. They also discussed the importance of creating a supportive and caring community, where neighbors looked out for each other and where children felt safe and protected. The meeting was a turning point for the community. It marked a shift from silence and inaction to awareness and action. The neighbors vowed to be more vigilant, more proactive, and more willing to intervene if they suspected that a child was in danger. They also reached out to Ella and Susan, offering their apologies, their support, and their friendship. They realized that they had failed Ella in the past, but they were determined to be there for her in the future. The community, once divided by fear and indifference, was now united by a shared commitment to protecting its children and to creating a safer, more nurturing environment for all. Ella's story, though tragic, had become a catalyst for change, a reminder that even in the darkest of circumstances, hope can emerge, and communities can heal. They had all learned a valuable, painful lesson. Ella and Susan's new life began with a fresh start, far away from the shadows of their past. They moved to a small, quiet town in North Carolina, a place where they could rebuild their lives, heal their wounds, and find a sense of peace and security. Susan found a job as a yoga instructor at a local studio, her passion for wellness providing a source of strength and stability. She also continued her own therapy, working through the guilt and trauma she had carried for so long. Ella was enrolled in a new school, a small, supportive environment where she could catch up on her missed education and begin to make new friends. She was initially shy and withdrawn, still carrying the emotional scars of her past, but with the help of her teachers, counselors, and a few kind classmates, she gradually began to open up, to participate in activities, and to rediscover her love of learning. She continued her therapy with Dr. Lee, who helped her to process the trauma she had endured, to develop coping mechanisms for her anxiety and flashbacks, and to rebuild her sense of self-worth. Dr. Lee also worked with Susan, helping her to understand Ella's needs, to communicate effectively with her, and to create a safe and nurturing home environment. The relationship between Ella and Susan deepened and strengthened. They spent hours talking, sharing their feelings, and rebuilding their trust. They went on outings together, exploring their new town, visiting parks, museums, and libraries. They cooked meals together, watched movies together, and simply enjoyed each other's company. Ella slowly began to heal. The nightmares became less frequent, the flashbacks less intense, the anxiety less overwhelming. She started to smile again, to laugh again, to experience the simple joys of childhood. She rediscovered her love of drawing, filling sketchbooks with images of flowers, animals, and fantastical creatures. She started writing poetry again, using words to express her emotions, to tell her story, and to imagine a brighter future. She made new friends, girls who accepted her for who she was, who didn't judge her for her past, and who supported her on her journey of healing. She started to participate in school activities, joining the art club and the drama club, discovering new talents and passions. She still had moments of sadness, moments of fear, moments of doubt, but she no longer felt alone. She had her mother, her therapist, her friends, and a growing community of support. She had learned that she was strong, resilient, and capable of overcoming even the most horrific of circumstances. She had learned that she was worthy of love, respect, and happiness. She had found her voice, and she was determined to use it, to speak out against child abuse, to help other victims, and to create a world where no child would have to endure the pain and suffering she had experienced. Ella's journey was far from over, but she was on the right path, moving forward, one step at a time, towards a future filled with hope, healing, and the promise of a life well lived. She was a survivor, and she would thrive.